Before she could find her table, the woman in the midnight blue gown was stopped at the edge of the ballroom by a hand closing hard around her wrist. The grip belonged to a silver-haired woman in burgundy velvet, whose diamonds caught the chandelier light like splinters of glass, and whose voice, when it came, was loud enough to cut clean through the string quartet. "The staff entrance is around the back, dear. You can't just wander in through the front." A few heads turned, a few more pretended not to. And then, when Naomi Adjei calmly asked to have her arm released, the older woman's face flushed with the particular fury of someone unaccustomed to being told no, and she raised her free hand and slapped her across the cheek. The sound of it landed in a gap between songs, sharp and small and somehow enormous, and the whole corner of the room went still. Not one of the 200 people in that hall knew that the woman now standing with a red mark blooming on her face was the chief executive whose signature or whose refusal to sign would decide whether the Caldwell family kept its fortune or watched it come apart by morning. 11 minutes later, a single phone call would begin to take it all away. The Hartley Foundation Gala was the kind of evening Toronto's old money treated as a sacrament. It was held every February in the Grand Hall of a heritage hotel, just off University Avenue. The one with the marble staircase and the ceiling painted with faded gold leaf, and the people who came to it had been coming for 30 years, some of them for longer than that. They arrived in long black cars that idled in a slow river along the curb, while the wind came hard off the lake and snapped at the valets' coats. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of lilies and good scotch, and the faint chemical sweetness of expensive perfume. Waiters moved through the crowd in quiet, practiced arcs, balancing trays of champagne and small, impossible canapés, trained to be present and invisible at the same time, trained to read in half a second which guest wanted attention and which wanted to be left to hold court. The guests moved through it more loudly, conscious of being watched and pleased to be, because in that room being seen was its own kind of confirmation. It was a place where names did most of the talking, where what your grandfather had built mattered more than what you had, and where a charity for children's hospitals served mostly as the backdrop for the real business of the night, which was the careful arrangement of who still belonged and who was merely visiting. Somewhere under the painted ceiling and the orchestra and the warmth manufactured for the occasion, a deal worth $1.2 billion sat unsigned, waiting on a woman almost no one in the room could pick out of a crowd. Naomi Adjei did not live the way people assumed a billionaire lived, mostly because almost no one ever guessed she was one. She was 44 years old, and if you passed her on a sidewalk on a gray Tuesday in March, you might notice the unhurried way she carried herself and nothing else. She did not announce herself when she entered a room. She had a habit, formed over decades, of sitting quietly at the edge of a conversation and listening until she understood it completely before she said a word, and when she finally spoke, the people around her had the disorienting experience of realizing she had understood the thing better than any of them. She had grown up in a third-floor walk-up in Scarborough, the daughter of a woman who cleaned offices on the night shift and a father she barely remembered, and she had learned early the difference between being looked at and being seen. The first happened to her constantly, the second almost never. She had built halcyon networks out of a cramped office above a hardware store. With a $4,000 line of credit she'd talked a credit union into giving her when she was 26. She had written code until her eyes burned, had been turned away by venture funds, who could not quite say why they were passing, had nearly lost the whole thing twice, and had rebuilt it both times with the stubbornness of someone who had no soft place to fall back to. 20 years later, Halcyon was a logistics and data infrastructure company valued at just over $30 billion, the quiet backbone behind a third of the freight that moved across the country, and Naomi still came into the office before 6 most mornings and drank black coffee from a chipped mug while she read the overnight reports. She had inherited nothing, she had married no fortune, she had been handed no introductions in paneled rooms. She had simply made, across 2 decades, the thousands of small correct decisions that nobody is around to applaud, laid down one after another, like stones across a gap most people never even try to cross. She kept no publicist. She turned down nearly every interview. She had been on the cover of a national business magazine exactly once, and only after the editor agreed in advance that the piece would be about the company and not about her childhood. Because she had watched other founders fall in love with the story of their own success and grow brittle in exactly the places the work itself stayed strong. She trusted the work. She did not trust the story. The invitation to the Hartley Gala had come through her chief of staff 3 weeks earlier, and she had nearly declined it. What changed her mind was a line buried in the briefing notes. Among the foundation's honorary patrons that year was the Caldwell family, and Caldwell Industries was the very company her board had spent 4 months quietly preparing to acquire. Caldwell Industries was the sort of firm that looked, from the outside, exactly as solid as it had been in 1975. It had been founded by Roland Caldwell's grandfather, expanded by his father into shipping and warehousing and a sprawling portfolio of commercial real estate, and handed to Roland himself at the age of 39, fully assembled, a thing he had been raised to inherit rather than to build. Roland had managed it the way a man manages a house he grew up in. He had shaken the right hands at the right galas for 3 decades, sat on the right boards given to the right institutions, and the result was a social position that felt, from the inside, like the natural reward of good judgment rather than the accident of good timing. He was, in his own quiet estimation, a steward, and for a long while being a steward had been enough. But the warehouses had aged. The shipping arm had been undercut, year after year, by competitors who understood data in a way Roland never had. The debt had grown the way debt grows, first quietly and then loudly, and then in a way that demanded a solution rather than a plan. By that February, Caldwell Industries was 11 months from a wall it could not climb, and the only thing standing between the family and a very public collapse was an acquisition that would fold its logistics division into a larger, healthier company, retire the worst of the debt, and let Roland keep his name on a smaller, surviving piece of the thing his grandfather had made. The acquiring company was Halcyon Networks. The deal was scheduled to close the following Monday, and the signature that would make it real or unmake it belonged to a woman. Roland Caldwell had never once thought to look up. His wife had thought about her even less. Vivian Caldwell had married into the family 31 years earlier and had spent those years becoming more Caldwell than the Caldwells, the way converts often do. She chaired committees. She arranged seating. She knew to the inch where everyone in any given room stood in relation to everyone else, and she had built a private and elaborate map of the social world in which her own family occupied the center. She did not think of herself as cruel. She thought of herself as discerning. She believed she could tell at a glance who belonged in a room like this one and who had slipped in through a side door, and she took a quiet pride in the speed and accuracy of those judgments. That this particular talent had never once been tested against the truth had never occurred to her, because the people she judged so quickly had never been in a position to correct her. Naomi had arrived a little after 8, alone, having sent her chief of staff home an hour earlier. She had checked her coat, accepted a glass of sparkling water from a young server who smiled at her with real warmth, and begun to make her way toward the tables along the far wall, in no particular hurry, taking in the room the way she took in everything, quietly and completely. She was thinking about the briefing folder still sitting in her bag, about a clause in the Caldwell agreement her legal team wanted to revisit, when Vivian Caldwell stepped into her path. What Vivian saw was a woman she did not recognize, in a gown she could not place, holding a glass and moving toward the good tables as though she had a right to them. What she felt was the small hot spark of a map being violated. She did not pause to wonder whether she might be wrong. She reached out and caught the woman by the wrist and delivered the line about the staff entrance in the carrying voice she used when she wanted to be sure of an audience, and several people nearby heard it and looked over, and a few of them smiled the thin, uncomfortable smile of people watching something they have decided is not their business. Naomi looked down at the hand on her arm and then back up at the woman holding it. "Please let go of me," she said. Her voice was level. It did not climb. It was not a request so much as a fact placed gently on a table between them, and it was the levelness of it, more than anything, that undid Vivian Caldwell. She had expected fluster. She had expected the woman to redden and apologize and retreat, to confirm by retreating that the judgment had been correct. Instead, she got composure, and composure from a person she had already decided did not belong, felt to her like insolence. She released the wrist, and then, from somewhere deeper than the moment, from some reservoir of certainty she had been filling for 31 years, she raised her hand and brought it across Naomi's face. It is hard to describe afterward the quality of the silence that followed. The quartet had just finished a piece and not yet begun the next, and into that pause the sound of the slap arrived like something official, like a gavel. Every head within 10 meters turned. A waiter froze with a tray half lifted. Near the bar, a man stopped talking mid-sentence. and for a long, awful stretch of seconds, nobody moved. 40 people watched a woman get struck across the face in the middle of a charity gala, and not one of them stepped forward, and later almost none of them would be able to explain why, except to say that it had happened so fast that they hadn't been sure that it hadn't been their place. The truth which most of them would never quite admit was simpler and worse. They had looked at the woman who was struck, and the woman who struck her, and made, in a quarter of a second, the same lazy calculation Vivienne had made, and had decided that whatever this was, it was not theirs to interrupt. Two people did not make that calculation. The young server who had handed Naomi her sparkling water. Her name was Daniela Reyes, and she was 23 and working her third gala that winter to help with tuition. Set her tray down on the nearest table without a word, and walked straight toward them, her face white with anger. And a young man near the bar, a junior associate at an accounting firm, who had come as someone's plus one and who happened to have his phone already in his hand, had begun, the instant Vivienne's hand went back to record. Naomi did not stagger. She did not raise her own hand. She stood very still, and a red mark rose slowly along her cheekbone, and she looked at Vivienne Caldwell for a moment longer than was comfortable for anyone watching. Then she reached into her small clutch, took out her phone, and stepped back from the older woman as though stepping away from something that had begun to smell of rot. Daniela reached her first. "Are you all right?" she said, low and fierce, putting herself half-hunched between the two women. "I saw the whole thing. I'll tell anyone who asks exactly what happened." "Thank you," Naomi said quietly. "I'm all right." And she was, in the way that mattered. The sting on her cheek was already fading. What remained was something cooler and clearer, the particular calm that had carried her through 20 years of rooms where people decided what she was before she opened her mouth. Vivienne, by now, had recovered enough to be indignant. "Don't you dare make a scene," she said, her voice rising again, performing for the gathering crowd. "I will have you removed. Do you have any idea?" And here she stopped, because she had been about to say, "Do you have any idea who I am?" And even she could feel, somewhere underneath the anger, how badly the moment was about to invert that question. Naomi was no longer looking at her. She had lifted her phone to her ear, and she was speaking into it, calmly, briefly, the way a person gives an instruction they have already thought through. "It's me," she said. "I want everything on Caldwell paused. Effective now. Don't sign anything Monday. I'll explain in the morning." She listened for a moment. "Yes, everything. Thank you." And she ended the call and slid the phone back into her clutch, and the whole thing took perhaps 40 seconds, and almost no one in the room understood that they had just watched the most expensive 40 seconds any of them would ever witness. Roland Caldwell understood it about 11 minutes later. He had not seen the slap. He had been across the hall near the bar, deep in a conversation with two members of the consortium that was financing his side of the acquisition, holding a glass of scotch he was too anxious to drink, when a man named Edwin Hale detached himself from a knot of people near the doors and came toward him with a strange expression on his face. Edwin Hale sat on the finance committee of the consortium. He had been pleasant and social all evening, and the thing that had happened to his face in the last few minutes was the kind of change the people around him noticed without being able to name. He reached Roland, touched his elbow, leaned in close, and said 3 words that Roland Caldwell would replay in his memory for the rest of his life. "The deal's off." Roland laughed. It was a brief, involuntary laugh, the laugh of a man who is certain he has misheard and expects the correction to come immediately. Then he looked at Edwin's face and stopped laughing. He asked what he meant. And Edwin told him, in a low and careful voice, that the acquisition had been formally paused as of 9 minutes ago, that Monday's signing was cancelled, that the instruction had come directly from the chief executive of the acquiring company, by phone, from somewhere inside this very room. "That's not possible," Roland said. "Adjei isn't even." He stopped. He had been about to say Adjei isn't even here, because his assistant had told him weeks ago that the famously private chief executive of Halcyon Networks rarely attended this sort of event, and Roland had not bothered to confirm it because it had not seemed important. He felt, standing there, the first cold edge of a thought he could not yet complete. "Roland," Edwin said gently, "where is your wife?" The two men found her near the center of the room, still standing over the woman in the midnight blue gown, still flushed, still talking. A small crowd had gathered, and at the edge of it stood the young server, with her arms crossed and her chin up, and the young man with his phone still recording, and a member of the hotel's security staff who had arrived and was trying, without much success, to understand what he had walked into. Vivienne was in the middle of a sentence when she saw her husband's face, and the sentence died in her mouth because she had been married to Roland Caldwell for 31 years, and she had never once seen him look the way he looked now. "Vivienne," he said. His voice was very quiet. "What did you do?" She did not understand the question, or rather, she understood the words and not the weight underneath them. "This woman tried to walk straight into the patrons section," she began, "and when I asked her to, 'Do you know who this is?' Roland said." And Vivienne, who had built her entire life on the certainty that she always knew who everyone was, looked at the woman she had struck and felt, for the first time in years, the floor tilt beneath her. Naomi let the silence sit for a moment. She was not cruel about it. There was no satisfaction on her face, no flicker of triumph, only a kind of weary clarity. When she spoke to Roland, not to Vivienne, and she kept her voice low enough that the crowd had to lean in to hear it. "My name is Naomi Adjei," she said. "I run Halcyon Networks. My company was going to sign an agreement on Monday to acquire your logistics division and refinance most of your debt. I came tonight to look at the people I'd be partnering with." She paused. "I've seen what I needed to see." Roland's face had gone the color of ash. He began to speak, and the words that came out were the wrong ones, and he knew they were wrong even as he said them. "Miss Adjei, I am so sorry, my wife. She didn't know who you were. If she had known," and Naomi stopped him with a small shake of her head, and what she said next was the thing that Roland Caldwell would think about in the long gray months that followed, the thing that mattered more than the money. "That's the part you don't understand," she said. "It would be a smaller problem if she'd known and behaved the way she did anyway, because then it would only be hatred, and hatred at least knows itself. But she didn't know. She had no idea who I was. To her, I was nobody. Just a woman in a dress she'd decided didn't belong. And that's what I came here to learn. Not how your family treats people it needs. Anyone can be gracious to the people they need. I wanted to know how it treats the people it thinks are no one. Because that's the only honest test there is." She let that settle. "I build things meant to last. I don't build them on a foundation like this one." Vivienne had found her voice again, though it was thinner now. "You can't be serious. Over a misunderstanding? Do you have any idea what this will do to?" "I have a very precise idea," Naomi said. "That's rather the point." It was at that moment that a second figure made his way through the crowd. Not a guest, but a uniformed officer of the Toronto Police, called by the hotel's duty manager the instant the security guard had relayed that a guest had struck another guest and there was video. Constable Whitfield was young and unhurried, and she had taken statements at enough black tie events to know that wealth changed the decor, but not the law. She spoke first to Naomi quietly, asking whether she wished to make a complaint. And here the room held its breath because everyone watching expected the powerful woman to wave it away, to be too gracious, too elevated, to let it go. Naomi did not wave it away. She thought about it for a moment, about her mother, who had been spoken to like furniture in 100 lobbies, who had swallowed it every time because swallowing it was the price of keeping the job, about every room she herself had walked into and been redirected toward the service entrance. About all the women watching now who would go home and tell this story in need, at the end of it, for once, for there to be a consequence. And she understood that letting it go would feel like grace and would actually be something closer to abandonment. "Yes," she said to the constable, "I'd like to make a statement. She assaulted me. There's video, and there are witnesses." She nodded toward Daniela and the young man with the phone. "I'd like it handled properly." What happened next happened with a dreadful, procedural calm. Constable Whitfield took Vivienne Caldwell's name. She took the young man's video as evidence. She took Daniela Reyes's statement, and Daniela gave it clearly, and without a tremor. And then, in front of 200 of the people whose opinion Vivienne had spent 31 years arranging her life around, the constable informed her that she was being charged with assault, read her rights from a small laminated card, and asked her to come with her, please, without making this any harder than it needed to be. Vivienne Caldwell, who had never in her life been told to do anything she did not wish to do, was walked out of the grand hall of a heritage hotel, past the marble staircase and the faded gold ceiling, and the silk and the diamonds parted to let her through, and not one of the people she had counted as friends met her eyes as she passed. Roland did not follow her out. He stood in the center of the room a moment longer, a 61-year-old man holding a glass of scotch he had still not touched, watching the architecture of his entire life rearrange itself around a single sound that had lasted half a second. Then he set the glass down on a passing tray and went to find his coat. The story moved the way stories move now, which is to say quickly and without permission. The young man's video was online before midnight. By the next afternoon, it had been watched several million times, and the clip had a shape the public found irresistible. The velvet, the diamonds, the carrying voice, the slap, the awful stillness of all those well-dressed people doing nothing, and then the quiet woman lifting a phone to her ear. The business press, which had spent years failing to get an interview with Naomi Adjei, suddenly had a great deal to say about her, most of it admiring and a little of it bewildered, as though they could not quite believe a person could be that powerful and that easy to overlook in the same evening. Halcyon Networks issued a single short statement confirming that it had withdrawn from discussions regarding Caldwell Industries and would not be commenting further. It did not need to comment further. The market did the commenting. Without the acquisition, the worst of Caldwell's debt came due with nothing behind it, and the lenders, who had been patient only because a rescue had seemed certain, stopped being patient. Within 6 weeks, the logistics division was sold off in pieces at fire sale prices to 3 different buyers, none of whom kept the Caldwell name. Within 4 months, the family had put the house in Forest Hill on the market. Roland Caldwell, who had inherited a fully assembled fortune at 39 and tended it like a garden for 3 decades, watched it bear, at last, the full weight of what had always been underneath it, and discovered that it could not. Vivian pleaded guilty to a reduced charge in a courtroom that took 11 minutes to deal with her. She paid a fine that meant nothing and was given a conditional discharge that meant a little more. And she stood on the courthouse steps afterward in a coat that was a season out of date and discovered that the photographers who had once jostled to catch her at galas were now jostling to catch her like this, and that the difference between the two was the whole of what she had spent her life building. Naomi did not celebrate any of it. People assumed she must have, but they were wrong, because they misunderstood what the thing had ever been about. She took no pleasure in the house going up for sale or in the photographs on the courthouse steps. The goal had never been to ruin the Caldwells. She had not, in fact, ruined them at all. She had simply declined to rescue them and then stepped back and let the structure they had built carry what it had never been built to carry. She had learned a long time ago that the most effective thing she could ever do in a world that kept underestimating her was not to argue with the underestimation, but to outlast it. To build something so plainly real that eventually even the people most determined to dismiss her would run out of language to do it with. She spoke about the gala exactly once, 10 days afterward, in a meeting with her senior leadership team, and she did not dramatize it. She did not call it a victory or a lesson or a statement about anything larger than itself, though she knew, better than any of them, how much larger than itself it was. She said only that the evaluation of a partner is never finished in the boardroom, that the real audit happens in the moments when no one important seems to be watching, and that she had simply watched. Then she moved on to the next item on the agenda, because there was always a next item, and the work, as ever, did not wait. There was one thing she did quietly that she did not mention in that meeting. She had Daniela Reyes's name passed to her chief of staff the morning after the gala, and she made sure the young woman's remaining tuition was paid in full, anonymously, with a note that said only that her grandmother would have been proud of how she'd stood up that night, and that there would be a job at Halcyon waiting whenever she wanted one. Daniela cried when she read it, and then she framed the note, and years later, when she ran a department of her own, she kept it on the wall where she could see it. As for the room, the 200 people who had stood and watched and done nothing, Naomi thought about them more than she thought about the Caldwells. She did not hate them. She understood them too well to hate them. They had not been cruel. They had merely been comfortable, and comfort, she had come to believe, was the soil that cruelty actually grew in, far more reliably than malice ever did. The matriarch in the velvet gown had needed only one thing to do what she did. A room full of decent people who had each, privately, decided it was not their place to interfere. That was the part worth remembering, not the slap, the silence around it. The slap had lasted half a second. The silence had lasted a great deal longer, and it was the silence, in the end, that the night had really been about. Naomi went back to her office the following Monday, the morning the deal would have closed, and she came in a little before 6, the way she always did, and she made her coffee in the chipped mug, and she read the overnight reports while the city outside her window slowly turned from black to gray to a thin winter gold. Somewhere across town, a heritage hotel was being readied for some other event, and a family in Forest Hill was learning to live inside a smaller version of itself, and a young woman who had set down her tray and walked toward trouble was telling the story to her mother over the phone. And the woman who had been struck across the face in front of 40 people who would not lift a finger sat quietly at her desk and turned to the next thing, which was the only direction she had ever really known how to face. She had been a girl in a third-floor walk-up in Scarborough once, watching her mother come home at dawn, smelling of other people's offices, and she had decided, even then, without the words for it, that she would build something no one could send around to the back. She had, and she already knew better than anyone in that ballroom would ever understand exactly how a thing like that begins and what it can become, and who in the end gets to decide.